Good evening, everyone. My name is Noah Deitch, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Carbon Removal, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan NGO based in California focused on developing positive solutions for negative emissions. Unfortunately, I am in California tonight. I would love to be there in person with you, but I'm very excited to hear about this gathering and to be able to speak with you about a very important topic for our work. The specific topic that I'm going to talk about today is something called bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration, which, according to many scientists, is the key linchpin for something called negative emission technologies. What I'd love to share with you today is a little bit about the importance of those technologies in fighting climate change and some of the challenges with how they are conventionally envisioned. And then link this back to the point of the Expo by sharing the potential but also the challenges for seaweed to act as a potential negative emission solution. So without further ado, I would like to start by sharing info about the importance of negative emissions in meeting climate goals. What I think makes this most clear is a recent paper from Science published by a group of European experts in climate action. What these scientists proposed is that in order to meet our climate commitments agreed to by over 100 nations at the Paris Climate Accords in 2015, we will have to dramatically reduce our carbon emissions. This is seen in the figure in the red line, which shows carbon emissions being cut in half globally every decade, starting in 2020. This is a monumental feat in and of itself. But that is not sufficient alone to actually deliver our goals. In addition, we will also have to reduce emissions from land use, which is the gray line, down to zero by 2050 on net. And then importantly for this presentation is to also scale up something called carbon removal, which is this blue line showing the net removal of CO2 from the atmosphere via industrial processes in only a few decades. I think a couple of key things to note from this graph is that by 2020, it's essentially zero, and that there are no large-scale negative emission projects set to be online by that date. What happens in order to meet our climate goals is that number will have to rise exponentially. First to the hundreds of millions of tons level a decade later by 2030, and then to the billion ton per year level by 2040 and growing every decade thereafter. What's important about that negative line can be seen clearly through economic models. And what this graph, also from a paper published in Science, shows is that the key technology to deliver those negative emissions is something called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Everything below the zero line in this graph is accomplished through the use of this technology called BECCS, which is the short for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, in which the biomass source sucks the carbon out of the air, and then through an industrial transformation, be it a power plant or some other sort of industrial factory, the CO2 is separated from the exhaust of that power plant and sequestered deep underground. As you can see, these economic models show the importance of BECCS to be enormous. Starting as early as 2030, there are dozens of BECCS projects built each year that eventually sequester tens of billions of tons of CO2 per year. That is a massive transformation and is on the order of about a quarter of our total emissions to date would need to be sequestered via BECCS in these models. Now, it's important to note that these are stylized economic models, and they're simply saying that given assumptions about the cost and availability of biomass, these are what the most economically optimal outcomes would look like. It's not to predict or project that there will be such large-scale BECCS. It's just saying that it would be economically optimal to use this technology at this scale. However, there are some serious concerns about the ability of conventional bioenergy with carbon capture and storage to scale to the level projected in some of these models. In particular, a research in Nature Climate Change shows that bioenergy with carbon capture would have significant amounts of impacts in terms of land use, water consumed, and nutrient consumption that would all present potentially large negative unintended consequences if done at scale. I think one of the most challenging pieces of the BECCS world is that in order to get these greater than 10 gigatons of CO2 removal per year through BECCS as envisioned today, some economic models show the transformation of land areas almost as large as the entire United States, dedicated entirely to bioenergy crop production for carbon capture and storage around the world. And that is a number that we have not fully analyzed the implications, but almost certainly would be challenging to an ever-growing population, ever-stressed climate from increasing climate change and other nutrient scarcity. However, there are a number of other ways envisioned to deliver large-scale negative emissions besides bioenergy with carbon capture. Some of those range from land-based methodologies, restoring ecosystems, expanding forests, sequestering carbon in soils through farming, for example. And others are pure technologies, direct air capture machines that operate as essentially synthetic trees to sequester carbon from the air and sequester that carbon either in long-lived materials like plastics or cements, or simply burying it underground. There is another alternative too, which everyone here at this event will be familiar with, which is alternate means for bioenergy production. And one of those alternate means, seaweed. Seaweed has not been explored extensively in the academic literature as a potential feedstock for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. But it could serve as just that type of solution. Large-scale seaweed cultivation could be used to power both biofuels for transportation and or bioelectricity through power generation. In the industrial process used for either of those technologies, it would be possible to capture carbon associated with the conversion of seaweed into energy and to sequester that carbon deep underground. If the seaweed is then replenished and grown back, it could act as a potential large-scale feedstock for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage units. And that feedstock could have a number of very important benefits. First and foremost, there wouldn't be any land use or water concerns associated with large-scale farming of seaweed. It would not compete with land uses for food production or for urbanization or for increased forestry, which in and of itself is an important carbon capture and storage solution. In addition, large-scale seaweed cultivation could provide really important co-benefits, helping to improve the resiliency of coastal areas that adopt seaweed farms, increasing the biodiversity already stressed in the ocean ecosystem, and potentially also increasing food security, either through greater marine fishery operations and or by providing a source of protein for animal feed to reduce the pressure for land-based food crops to feed livestock. That said, there is a reason that the climate models today do not include seaweed as a key piece of the bioenergy with carbon capture and storage challenge. The main reason is that in order to provide a significant impact to the climate, seaweed production would need to be scaled up several orders of magnitude from its current levels today. There simply is not a strong business case nor any practical experience with expanding seaweed cultivation to this level. There has been very little research and or commercialization of such large-scale seaweed farms. And because of that, there's less academic work linking seaweed's potential to the bioenergy with carbon capture and storage challenge. Nevertheless, there are a number of new research efforts underway today to start understanding the potential of seaweed as a potential climate solution. One of the more exciting ones here in the United States is the Department of Energy's ARPA-E program is exploring macroalgae research. And they're funding innovative projects to expand and reduce the cost of such large-scale seaweed farming. In addition, there are a number of groups such as the NGO Bellona in Norway, which have proposed ocean forestry projects, combining all of the co-benefits of increased food production, climate adaptation, and climate mitigation from these seaweed farms. Many of these seaweed operations do not have explicit ties to bioenergy with carbon capture and storage alone. However, once these projects do start to gain traction and the costs and scalability of large-scale seaweed cultivation becomes more well studied and known, it will be possible to start linking the two systems together and figuring out how to use bioenergy with carbon capture and storage from seaweed as a climate solution. Lastly, I'd like to conclude by sharing that this is something that is of interest in the United States, that the Algae Biomass Association has great resources for macroalgae aquaculture. And I've listed them here as well as their website, which has much more information on this and on interesting applications happening both in the United States and around the world. So I'll conclude my remarks here. Thank you again for taking the time and inviting me to present. And please don't hesitate to reach out and engage with our work at the Center for Carbon Removal if you have any questions and or ideas for collaboration around seaweed-based negative emission projects. Thank you.